I didn't appreciate the danger. I certainly do. When I look back on it, I shudder to think what we did. Well, it's quite a story actually. The local policeman at Beachport, where I was living, was transferred to Port Victoria, and he and my father were great mates, and he wrote and said that he could get me a position on the Passat, that he was friendly with the captain, if I wanted to do so, and so I did. So we left Port Victoria in the Passat in May 1948.
And what was the trip like?
It was very rough and very slow. It took us 49 days to Cape Horn, and in bad weather nearly all the way. And then a similar time to the line. Altogether we were 144 days from Port Victoria to Falmouth, which was a long trip. It was the winter time, which made things much worse, but sometimes of course you go down there to pick up the winds, and sometimes you can get a pretty fair wind and a pretty fair trip. But we were unlucky, and we had headwinds and side winds, and whichever way you'd like to ask them to come from. And we had a bad trip. All those vessels were undermanned. They were really designed for about 80-man crew, all told. We had, all told, captain and everyone, 34. So they were grossly undermanned. And at the end of their life, they were trying to maintain them in a seaworthy condition, but skimping as much as they possibly could to try and make them pay. You would have the heavy weather sails, and you would have the medium weather sails, and you have the light weather sails, and so on. So you were constantly changing sails. That was the general pattern with sailing ships, but more so in towards the end of their trading days. And everything, like, for example, here's another example. Not that this wasn't the pattern to a large degree anyway, but the navigation lights, they wouldn't put kerosene in them when they were down in the real southern latitudes. Why worry? There's no one here, and you were charging through the water there with no navigation lights at all, just to save kerosene. That's a pretty good example. Well, in those southern latitudes in sailing ships, and it mattered, of course, whether you had a good run or a bad run, and we had a bad run. Down there, ice and snow, you're aloft, and I recall one time when I came down, and others the same, with the back of our oilskins torn to shreds from the hailstones, the big hailstones hitting us. There was no point in wearing gloves, you never even dreamt of that, and the sails would be stiff and cold and so forth with the ice and the cold. And whilst it didn't happen to me, it happened to other people, other men aboard, that you're trying to furl the sail and it would blow back and out would come fingernails. And it was a pretty tough life down there, that's for sure. The arrangement on those sailing ships was that there was a porpoise, as the Finns called them, because it was Swedish that were spoken on the ship. The mates and that could speak broken English, but you soon learnt the bare essentials. But the man was called a porpoise, and the mate would give one whistle, one shriek whistle, and that would be for the porpoise to go and do whatever he wanted to do, trim a light or whatever. 2 whistles was for the watch to come out, and the 3 whistles was for all hands on deck. And you'd be so tired and so cold and so long without sleep that it didn't matter that your bunk was saturated. You'd curl up and hoping to get some sleep, and you could hear the whistles. The one whistle, it's still in my mind today. I can hear it as I'm talking now. The one whistle, porpoise, 2 whistle, not my watch, 3 whistle, the dreaded 3 whistle, all hands on deck. And as I say, it's with me today. I hear it still.
Good. What about the food?
Well, I didn't find the food bad. A lot of people did complain. They took a couple of pigs to give them a bit of fresh meat, and they were eventually slaughtered. And that would be a story in itself, how they'd usually muck that up. Eventually they'd shoot the pig. They'd try and cut its throat, and the pig would escape, and goodness only knows what. But then the big event was to catch its blood, and you'd have blood pancakes, which the Swedes really thought was good. And actually I didn't mind them, but there were other Australians aboard, and they just couldn't face up to a blood pancake. But they were good. And they had bread. It's a little bit like some of our hard biscuits today, Kanaka bread. It was in their language, and they would bring it out of the hold and get it on deck, and they would knock all the weevils out, and that's what you would have for bread. And you'd need sharp teeth, I can tell you. But as I say, I didn't really mind the food, but and they took a fair bit of tin stuff and that from Australia. And I came home on that ship too. Came back around the Cape of Good Hope, and no, I didn't mind the food, but I'm just an rough old fisherman guy, you know.
Did you have salt meat?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Salt meat in cask.
Oh, yes. There was salt meat and in cask. I was talking to another Cape Horner recently, and they had salted fish. And whereas the pigs were kept a bit forward of midships because the tail wind would blow the smell away, on this particular journey this fellow was on, they had the salted fish aft, and he said it was putrid, and you could smell this continual smell until eventually they ate it. But again, I didn't mind their salted fish, but then perhaps I'm easy to please because a lot of people did. Yeah. Around Cape Horn, of course, and before we left Australia, and the hatches were well belted down and canvassed over and so on, etc. And the life nets were strung up. And I remember thinking at the time, gee whiz, that's high. You have a life net up as high as that, and you couldn't jump up to get it. But I realised, or soon came to learn why, these experienced Swedes and Finns, they knew all about Cape Horn. I think the captain on that at that time had been around Cape Horn about 35 times. He was an old man, but so he knew all about Cape Horn.
What was his name?
The captain's name was Hagerstrand, Captain Ivar Hagerstrand, who I thought was a fine fellow, a very capable seaman, as most of those Åland Islanders are. But what would occur there, particularly in those southern latitudes, mind you, of course, you can get bad weather everywhere, but you would have to go down into the well deck to clew the sails up. In other words, to spill the wind out of them so you could get aloft and attempt to fill them. And when you did, the mate would be standing there with a torch, and he'd be keeping an eye on the sea, and then he'd yell out, "Jump!" And you would spring to whatever you could and hang on, because she would lurch and the sea would come over higher than this safety net they'd put there. And if you were slow on your feet or slow thinking, well, you were very likely to get washed overboard. There was many a time on this journey where people, the sea, they couldn't hang on. The sea would come aboard so hard, smash aboard the vessel, they'd get swept around, and you'd think, gee, is he going to survive this? Could be washed up against the side of the ship or washed up against a bollard or something like that. So that was a fairly common occurrence. That's why I said earlier that you were constantly wet. You just couldn't stay dry, and you couldn't stay warm. And again, I didn't actually witness this, but I've heard other Cape Horners, Australians actually, say that they were so cold that they peed in a bottle, then took the bottle to bed to try and warm their feet. So that's the kind of, the desperate acts you get to. These days, I'm sure you would go better equipped. You'd have better clothing and that, and you wouldn't be. But we're talking. This was 1948 that I'm talking about, and so you didn't know much better.
So you came back again on the Passat the next year?
Yes, I came back. I suppose as much as anything because it was a way of getting home.
So did you go to the Åland Islands for layup?
No, we didn't. She was planned, that was what was planned for her to go to Åland Islands, but fortunately they got another cargo out again. So she was dry docked in Port Talbot. Yes, Port Talbot, I think, yes. And out she came again. I always had a great desire to go to Åland Isles because when I look back I was a young Australian aboard these ships, and most of the crew and skippers and the skipper and mates and everything came from the Åland Isles, so I always heard about these Åland Islands. Of course now then, as time's gone by and I've met some of them again, they were just as fascinated by me being an Australian. But I've always wanted to go, and 3 years ago I had an opportunity to go back there to a Cape Horners Congress and meet some of those young people that were on the ship with us. And incidentally, this is a little bit of a story. There was a steward aboard the ship that came from the Åland Isles because they had 2 or 3 passengers when they first left Maraham. They were going down to East London with a load of timber, and he went on condition that he could take his wife and she would be the stewardess. And anyway, what occurred that she became pregnant, and before I boarded the ship, somewhere in the Indian Ocean, this little baby boy was born, and it was only about 6 weeks or 8 weeks old when I joined the ship, and so we had this young baby. When I went to the Åland Islands, there was a middle-aged man, well, he'd be 52 then, and anyway we got talking, and I discovered that it was this little baby that was on that ship. So he was a real Cape Horner. At this function that we were at, you had to be a Cape Horner, and he was a Cape Horner, that was for sure. Well, we arrived back in Australia, I think it was around about June, that'd be 1949. I think my memory might be a bit wrong there, but we came back in ballast, and that's why those ships, of course, they weren't, how could they be profitable like that? But anyway, I escaped the job of unloading all the ballast because I left the ship in Port Victoria. A lot of the young fellows that joined it there, they would have had the job of ballast, digging all that ballast out in baskets over the side. You'd do it in a few hours with the equipment they've got today, but it was a long, laborious task then. I still haven't got very good thoughts about Port Victoria. It's a pretty barren place, pleasant jetty, pleasant sea view, but the place itself, hot northerly wind in Australia, and you can imagine what it'll be like in January and February, and the dust and so forth. So that's that side of Port Victoria. But on the other side of it, the people were extremely friendly and homely country people. And I suppose what sticks in my mind most of all is the huge wheat stacks, the bags of wheat ready to go. They're all stacked up on the foreshore, and a lot of work into that to get those wheat to there, but there was a lot of work too to load it onto the ships out on the ketches, and then manhandle them up onto the ship and pack them all away and so forth. When you look back and you see these container ships today, well, no wonder they didn't pay. But it was a tremendous feat to take ships of that size and big square rigged ships and to take them, because a sextant and a clock, that was their only navigational aids. and how they got around. They had an old wireless they could receive when they got a little bit close to land, but there was no transmitting sets. So they did a tremendous job. And of course, when you're so far south, and this is what would happen, they'd get pushed further south trying to get wind, the right winds, and of course then you've got the threat of icebergs. And I recall one night, and I was on watch. I was right up the bow, and anyway, I saw a light. Then, after a long while, I didn't like to ring the bell and make a galah of myself in case I was seeing things. But anyway, the next thing I saw a second light. Oh, I better. So I rang the bell, and the mate came racing forward. And in the time that he took to come from midships to where I was, up came the moon. With the 2 points, 2 points of the moon. So lots of stories like that can happen. Mm.
Any other incidents that stick in your mind?
Well, I recall one night, and the ship, they were caught with too much sail on, and the ship was leaning to such a degree that all the watch was on deck, was up aloft, but she was leaning to such a degree they couldn't get back to come down. That was an example, and all you really could do was watch and hope and wait till the wind to go. It was about abreast of Cape Horn. The ship was in real danger. The captain was so concerned that he called us all on deck, and we stood under the forecastle head. The ship had heeled over to such a degree, and the weather was so bad that you couldn't get aloft to cut that sail free, not without high risk. Although the first mate, who was a Superman type of man, he was the toughest man you could ever dream could exist. He was prepared to have a go, but the captain wouldn't let him, because it was near certain that he wouldn't have got there. But anyway, God was looking kindly on us that day, and most of the young crew, they didn't really realise the danger they were in, and I don't think I did either. But when I look back and think about, that's why we're under the forecastle head, and the skipper didn't think that boat was going to come out of that. But there were good times too, up in the southeast trade winds and the tropics and so forth. That's a different thing once you turn that corner. Although we struck bad weather, we just had a calver trip right up to the Falkland Isles, and then it eased off a little bit. But you get up into the southeast trade winds and so forth, and that's why people go back on those ships. They remember the good times, and that was it. The trip home, trip back to Australia, that was a picnic compared to Cape Horn. We came down around the Cape of Good Hope. The only land we saw was the Tristan da Cunha, the islands there. Saw that in probably 10, 12 mile away, but we had quite a good trip. I've forgotten how many days. I think about 96 days, I think. And then we were, when I say 96 days, we were caught behind Kangaroo Island with a good sou'easter, and we couldn't turn to get up, make headway enough to get up to the Gulf. And it was funny because I'd had a background in fishing, and I knew the weather, and I knew all about southeasterly winds from my fishing days, and I used to say to the other members of the crew, look, we'll be here for so many days we can't make headway, because I know this southeasterly, it'll eventually turn easterly and away we'll go. And anyway, this must have got back to the captain, and he called me up to his saloon and asked me, I was only 18, he asked me, what could he expect, how long would it last? And luckily I was able to say it quite accurately, and sure enough we come up the Gulf. But that was peculiar too, because we had, I think they were the first two German seamen allowed abroad after the war, if my memory serves me right. And the second mate was a German who he'd been in the cadet ships, but he wasn't, really experienced man. And the skipper decided to tack to come up into the Gulf, and this young German was the second mate, and he mucked it up completely. And the old skipper took off his cap and jumped on his cap in rage at what had happened. Because we had to wear ship then, and those ships, you're talking, say, 4-mile circle to get around. And eventually that's what we had to do, and up the Gulf we went. And that was good. Well, looking back, yes, it has had a bearing on my life, but I've had a very busy life. I've been a fisherman and plenty of problems there, and you're that busy that you don't really know. But I suppose it certainly doesn't tend to make you look for luxuries. You realise how tough things can be. And it wasn't until I went to the Åland Islands several years ago, and people you'd been on the ship with, some I didn't recognise, couldn't remember. I thought, well, gee, how all those years have passed, and it started me thinking a lot more about those days, you know.
Would you do it all again?
If I was 18, and knowing what, yes, I suppose I would. It was adventurous, and that's why most people did it. Pre-war, a lot of young South Australians made that trip as a way to get to England. They didn't have the money. It was a little bit after the Depression. They didn't have the money, and they used it as a way of getting to the UK. Some of them, the war broke out. Those went in the 38, 39, those years, and they joined the British forces. Really, when I look back, you were given no chance to find your sea legs within 24 hours of going aboard the Passat up aloft. No, can you, are you frightened or anything, up aloft. And you went right to the very top, and they made sure you did, and so on. Well, my best memories, of course, are up in the final weather. In the tropics, southeast trade winds, there wasn't a lot of work to do there because the winds blew steadily from the one direction, and you didn't have to wear ship or that, or be taking in sails too much. That was a good life, but oh no, it was the same old story with a bunch of other young people, and it's all one big adventure. And you were young and you were silly, and of course, as a young Australian, you were wondering what England was going to be like when you got there. So. Yes, it was certainly a big occasion in my life, a big event in my life, and it's amazing that some of the young Australians that went on those ships after the war, they'd had perhaps 5 or 6 years in the services. One person I've got in mind, he was a fighter pilot, and another one was on the bridge of the Sydney, was it, or Australia, when she was Japanese dive bombed. And I've often said to them, why are you so fascinated and pay so much attention, to your Cape Horn days when you've had all that other experience? And their reply was, well, look, lots of other people were in the services, but in the Cape Horn it was unique, more above any of their servicemen. Some of these were in action and so forth, etc. But they've been staunch Cape Horn people ever since. It stuck in their mind, probably more than what it stuck in my mind.
So there's some sort of shared camaraderie or shared experience?
Yeah, there is. There's a definite, because you realise that it's a pretty unique lot of people. We were in Chile several years ago to a Cape Horners Congress. The various countries hold these congresses every couple of years, and we were going along in the bus, and 2 or 3 policemen on motorcycles and so forth, etc. And I thought, oh geez, what have we done now? But anyway, the Chilean guide got off and spoke to them, and we had a police escort all the way down to Valparaiso and back and around about, and I said, well, how come? He said, well, you are unique people. And I thought, well, I suppose that is true. There's not many of them left. I remember when I was in London and I met with an old man. He was an old man then, an old Cape Horner, and he asked how old I was, and I told him, and he said, when you're as old as I am, he said, the only Cape Horners we left will be liars, because there'll be none left, and that's how it is. Their ranks are thinning very, very rapidly. And as a matter of fact, these congresses that have been held since about 1935, every couple of years, in May they held their last one, because the ranks are thin.